Okay, next I'm going to introduce Ruth Lanius, who is the director of the Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder, PTSD, Research Unit at the University of Western Ontario. So she established the Traumatic Stress Service and the Traumatic Stress Service Workplace Program and specializes in the treatment and research of PTSD. She also holds the Harris Woodman Chair in Mind-Body Medicine at the Schulich School of Medicine and Dentistry at the University of Western Ontario. And the title of this talk is going to be, I'll actually read it off the slide this time to get it right, Childhood Trauma and the Development of the Self, Clinical and Neurobiological Perspectives.
Thanks, Michelle, and thanks, Darsha, for organizing such an exciting meeting with such broad perspectives that we can all try to synthesize and metabolize. I think it's really important to approach the subject from a broad perspective. I think it makes it much richer. Can you guys hear me? Is the mic on, or does it need to be adjusted? Is that good? All right. So as Michelle already said, I'm going to talk about childhood trauma and the development of the self, and both clinically and from a neurobiological, mainly neuroimaging perspective. And my approach is going to be a little bit different because I'm going to be talking mainly about what happens in adults who've experienced significant childhood trauma. But at the end of the talk, I'm going to come back and talk about implications for the intergenerational transmission and implications for early intervention. To start out with, I'd like to thank all my collaborators without whom this work would not have been possible, my PTSD research team, the London Health Sciences Traumatic Stress Service, who regularly refer patients, as well as some of the collaborators that have been involved in this work, particularly Paul Fruin, who was a PhD student in our lab and has now accepted a position and continues to collaborate closely with us, Robin Bloom, who was the postdoc who was involved in a lot of the work on the default mode network that I'll be talking about. So basically, I want to focus on three areas that I think are very much affected by chronic early life trauma. One is that of emotional awareness. The other one is emotion dysregulation, with a focus on positive emotions and maybe relating that to some of the discussions we've had about play earlier on today, as well as social emotions and the difficulty our patients often have with social interaction. And then how emotional awareness and emotion regulation really relate to the sense of self that's often very fragmented and full of self-hatred in our patients who've experienced chronic early life trauma. So these are going to be the three areas of focus, and I'll end with a discussion on clinical implications, as I said, both in terms of early intervention and psychotherapy for our adult patients. I want to start out by talking a little bit about diagnosis. Kristen just brought up the problem with the DSM. I'm going to be focusing mainly today on patients with a primary diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, but I want to also start out by discussing the diagnostic issues that we have, and that we don't really have a diagnosis to capture the complexity of the symptoms people with chronic early life trauma often experience. And so the way we've dealt with this is in our research to look at specific symptoms, often in relationship with what happens in the brain. So post-traumatic stress disorder, I think you're all familiar with it. In order to meet criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, you have to have been exposed to a traumatic event. And I think the core symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder really is that even though the trauma may have experienced years and years ago, you feel like it's happening now. So it's a memory of the present. So people often have all the anxiety and the fear responses that they had at the time of the trauma. They're experiencing them as if it's happening right now. And this re-experiencing can also happen in the form of reliving nightmares. So often people will have a reliving nightmare. They will awaken at night and not even realize they're here, and it usually takes them a few minutes to reorient themselves to the present. So intense re-experiencing symptoms. Then you have avoidance symptoms, so avoiding things that remind you of the trauma. And part of that symptom cluster also deals with symptoms of emotional numbing. So really being dead to both positive and negative emotions. And of course, this is a huge problem for people, and they'll often tell you, you know, I can't experience loving feelings towards my children or towards my partner. And this often, of course, leads to a lot of problems within the family structure. And we'll be getting back to these symptoms of emotional numbing. And then hyperarousal symptoms, poor sleep, poor concentration, intense irritability and anger. Again, this often leads to problems in interpersonal situations. Hypervigilance, so always feeling like you're on guard, and having an increased startle response. So that sort of encapsulates the core post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms. But when we think about what our patients who've been chronically traumatized during childhood experience, we know that a lot of them meet criteria for PTSD, but we also know that their symptoms are much more complex. And I think one diagnosis that's currently included in the research criteria of the DSM is the diagnosis of complex PTSD, or disorders of extreme stress not otherwise specified, that was first coined by Judith Herman and then also really promoted in the DSM-4 field trials by Bessel van der Kolk. And I think this diagnosis helps us to understand the complexity of these patients in greater detail. And so the core symptom of complex post-traumatic stress disorder is really a problem in regulating affective arousal. And I think this is one of the main difficulties that actually brings our patients to the emergency department or to inpatient units. So patients will often describe that they feel like they're on an emotional roller coaster, up and down, and that they have almost no control over regulating their emotions. So they may tell us that in the morning they may feel fine, 5 minutes later they may feel intensely angry, 2 hours later they may feel despondent, depressed, an hour later, they may feel like cutting themselves and feeling intense self-loathing. So it's a continual roller coaster. And I think if we as mental health care professionals don't understand that that is actually the core of their symptoms, we may say to them, well, you know, what the hell is wrong with you? You were okay half an hour ago. So where do these symptoms come from? And I think it takes us back to the attachment relationship, takes us back to Bowlby, who talked about a secure base, right? And that for an infant's nervous system to learn how to regulate itself, it really needs the secure base. So when the infant's tired and cranky, or when it's hungry, or when its diaper is wet, it really needs a caregiver to help soothe that nervous system. And then over time, that nervous system learns how to calm itself down. But when the infant hasn't had that secure base, it's not surprising that the nervous system is like a roller coaster and that it can't calm itself down. And so that's often what we see, and I think that's also what often relates to other problems that people develop. For example, substance use, right? If you feel continually out of control and like you're on an emotional roller coaster, it's not surprising that people turn towards drugs or alcohol in an attempt to sort of dampen that emotion dysregulation, or that they turn towards disordered eating, overeating, or binge purging, or starving themselves. You know, often when we talk to our patients, you know, so what happens when you starve yourself? They'll say to us, at least then I don't feel that much for a limited period of time. And as soon as I start eating again, then I have intense feelings again. I think gambling also comes in here. Again, it's a way to take yourself away from this emotional roller coaster. And so when we see all these additional problems in our patients, I think it's often very important to relate them to the actual etiology, which is emotion dysregulation. I think otherwise often they don't make sense. And I think that's another problem with the DSM, that, you know, we don't see the symptoms in context in which they occur. So that's really a core symptom, that of emotion dysregulation. Then we have this problem in alterations in attention and consciousness, and that's where dissociation comes in. And of course, dissociation can range in the spectrum in which it occurs, but basically dissociation is, as Frank Putnam has always said, an escape when there's no escape. And I think if we approach it like that, it's really a no-brainer. And so when we think about if one of us is downtown South Bend tonight and we get attacked, the most adaptive response is for us to fight back, right? Because that's going to decrease our chance of getting harmed. However, if we're a small child and we're dependent on our caregiver, and if the caregiver hurts us, fighting back is not the most adaptive response, right? Because it's going to increase our chances of getting hurt. So our nervous system has to find a way to escape when there's no escape. So how can the nervous system do that? Well, for example, through out-of-body experiences, so disconnecting yourself from your own body, feeling like it's not really happening to you, or through symptoms of derealization, feeling like things are not really real, sort of just pretending things aren't really happening. And then in the more severe cases, like we see in the dissociative disorders, it's really a fragmentation of the self, right? And so the memories and the emotions become so intense that you can't handle experiencing them all at the same time. And so you get this fragmentation. Then somatization problems. So our patients often are sent from one medical practitioner to another, and no organic cause is often found, even though we have an increased risk of health-related problems, as we heard earlier also. But often people have a lot of somatization symptoms, and I think Bessel van der Kolk's paper with the title "The Body Keeps the Score" really helps us to understand why people have somatization symptoms. Then, of course, chronic characterological changes. How can you have normal characterological development when you don't have a caregiver that you can rely on in terms of trust, who models appropriate anger, who shames you? How can you have normal characterological development? And then alterations in systems of meaning. And I think often when we talk to our patients and we say, you know, when was the last time you felt happy or you felt content or you were able to get pleasure from something, they'll say to us, you know, I can't remember a time when that ever happened. So I think complex PTSD really helps us to understand the complexity of symptoms, and you know, these symptoms are very often found in people with chronic histories of childhood trauma. You can also look at it in terms of psychiatric comorbidity. So when you have repeated early life trauma, yes, you can have PTSD, but you can have depression, you can have anxiety disorders, substance use disorders, somatization disorders, eating disorders, dissociative disorders, and personality disorders. And I think the key really is to start understanding the symptoms in context in which they occur, no matter what you want to call it. And really to study certain symptoms in relationship to what happens neurobiologically so we can get a better understanding of the mechanism underlying some of these symptoms. So now I want to come back to the three very difficult problems I think we often see in people with chronic early life trauma that I mentioned earlier. So emotional awareness, emotion dysregulation, and the problems with the sense of self. So let's start talking about emotional awareness. What is emotional awareness? It's really the capacity to be aware of and describe emotions in oneself and others, and we heard this in one of the earlier talks this morning. And it's having the capacity to reflect upon internal experience of emotion, so really knowing what you feel, but also having an idea what the other person that you're communicating with is feeling, so this concept of mentalizing. And emotional awareness really enables increased self-reflection and regulation of affective states. So in order to be able to regulate your emotions, you have to be aware of what you're feeling, right? And so it's often referred to as the cornerstone of emotion regulation. How does emotional awareness develop? And I think this image really depicts sort of the foundation of emotional awareness, and that's the interaction between the caregiver and the infant and the child. And I think what you can see here is a mother who's really in tune with the infant, right? She's mirroring the infant's affect. You can see how comfortable the infant is in her hand. And she's able to mentalize, right? She's able to hold the mind of the infant in her own mind, right? And so I think that's really the foundation of emotional awareness. And I really like this quote by Diana Fosha, who says, "The roots of resilience and emotional awareness are to be found in the sense of being understood by and existing in the mind and heart of a loving, attuned, and self-possessed other." So what do we know about emotional awareness and post-traumatic stress disorder, keeping in mind that the patients we're going to talk about have a lot of other diagnoses as well, but have the primary diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder? So I want to think about emotional awareness as a continuum. So on the negative side, a lack of emotional awareness often manifests itself as symptoms of alexithymia, so not knowing what you feel and not having words for what you're feeling, or symptoms of emotional numbing, and we'll be talking about both of these today. So that's poor emotional awareness. On the other end of the spectrum, so being emotionally aware, I want to talk about being mindful, having the capacity to mindfully observe what's going on within us. And I want to look at the neural correlates of both ends of the spectrum with you today, and also talk about diagnostic implications. So how can we measure emotional awareness? Alexithymia can be measured by the Toronto Alexithymia Scale, which was developed by Bagby and Taylor and has been used in a variety of psychiatric diagnoses. And emotional numbing, we've measured by a scale that Paul Fruin and I developed around the feeling of being emotionally numb, and I'll talk about both of these scales briefly. So just to review a couple of representative items on the Toronto Alexithymia Scale so you get an idea of what kind of things we're asking our patients. So the first factor really deals with difficulty identifying feelings and distinguishing them from bodily sensations. So people are asked whether are you often confused about what emotion you're feeling, or you don't know what's going on inside of you. And then the second factor deals with difficulty describing and communicating feelings in words. So is it difficult for me to find the right words for my feelings, or people tell me to describe my feelings more? So it's not knowing what you feel and having difficulties describing feelings in words. And I want to share this clinical example with you that I think really gets at this concept of alexithymia. And what one of our patients said was, when I get emotions and stuff like that, I don't really feel them. I can say to someone, I feel sadness because tears are welling in my eyes, but I do not know what that really is. They're just physical symptoms, right? So she has no idea what she's feeling, and she cannot put her feelings into words. So what we wanted to do is look at a group of PTSD patients with a range of alexithymic symptoms and then correlate them with brain activation patterns while people recall their traumatic memory. And I want to point out two findings for you here. So these are correlational analyses. And what we found was that the more alexithymic people were, the less activation they had in the anterior cingulate and dorsomedial prefrontal cortex right here. And you'll be hearing a lot more about these areas. But the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex is an area that's really engaged in self-reflective awareness. So the more active this area, usually the more self-reflective people are. The other area that we found very correlated with alexithymia was the insula. And again, we found the more alexithymic people were, the less activation we saw in the insula on both sides. And what do we know about the insula? It's a structure that's received more and more attention in the cognitive neuroscience literature, and it really conveys bodily states to the brain. And it's really involved in bodily self-awareness. And so it allows us to be aware of what we're experiencing in our body, and then later on to connect those physical sensations to what feelings and emotions that we're experiencing. Craig is a researcher who's done a lot of work on the insula, and he said that the anterior insula of the non-dominant right hemisphere, possibly uniquely to humans, constitutes a basis for the subjective evaluation of one's condition, that is how you feel. So it's very interesting that the more alexithymia people have, the less activation in the insula they show. Now moving on to the related concept of emotional numbing, and I want to start out by showing a patient quote again that I think really shows the relationship between feeling numb and not having words for what you're feeling. This patient said, "It's like a blank. I think about my kids and I feel nothing for them. I'll be sitting there feeling confused and numb, and I wonder what I'm supposed to be feeling. It's like dead space. And when that happens, I have trouble using my words, finding my words. I can't talk, right? So she talks about this emotional deadness, but also this difficulty having words to describe her feelings. And as you hear this, I'm sure your wheels are already starting to turn and thinking about intergenerational transmission of trauma, of course. So we really wanted to capture people's difficulty feeling emotionally numb. And so we asked them, do you feel emotionally numb as if you can't experience emotions or feelings? Or do you feel like your emotional feelings are frozen, sedated, or numbed out so that you can't physically sense them? Or do you feel shut down in an emotional sense as if your emotional feelings have been turned off or tuned out in your body? Or do you feel cut off from your emotions and feelings so that you can't physically feel them even if you try? And again, we got people to rate this, and then we correlated those ratings with the fMRI findings. And what we found was that for both positive and negative emotions, the more emotionally numb people were on the measure, the less activation they again had in this dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, right? That's the area we talked about earlier, which is really involved in self-reflective awareness. So the more emotional numbness they had, the less activation in the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex. So we've talked about the negative end of the spectrum of emotional awareness, right? We've talked about alexithymia and emotional numbing, and how the less emotionally aware people are, the less activation they have in the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex. We've also talked about that the opposite end of the spectrum of emotional awareness is really having the capacity to mindfully observe and know what's happening within our bodies. And so what we wanted to do to start with in a group of healthy people, we wanted to capture a range of people who have a different capacity for mindful observing, and then use that to correlate it with the brain findings during recall of a stressful memory. And our prediction was that the more people were able to mindfully observe, the more activation they would show in the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex. And so we have a number of mindfulness scales available to us now, and the one we used was the Kentucky Inventory of Mindfulness Skills, and we really focused on the factor of mindful observing. So this scale asks people, for example, when I'm walking, I deliberately notice the sensations of my body moving, or I notice changes in my body, such as whether my breathing slows down or speeds up. Right? So these questions really tap into how aware you are of what physical sensations you're experiencing in your body. And interestingly, what we found was in the group of healthy subjects, the more people were able to mindfully observe, the more activation they had in this dorsomedial prefrontal cortex. As opposed to the emotionally numb PTSD subjects, the more numb they were, the less activation they had in the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex. And so, of course, the $2 million question is, if we are successful psychotherapeutically, for example, with the use of mindfulness skills to really teach people to learn how to mindfully observe and then connect those body sensations to feelings and emotions, can we bring the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex online? And that's something that we're looking at right now. Now, in terms of how do we do that, I think the body scans that have been developed by John Kabat-Zinn can be very helpful for patients, and we're using that clinically all the time to really carefully, at a pace that's comfortable for people, getting them to become aware of what's happening in their bodies. And of course, that can be very frightening for people because so much pain is situated in the body. But I think if you do it very carefully, having the patient be in control and pacing it at a pace that's comfortable for people, it can be very effective in really reconnecting people with their feelings. So now we're moving on to emotion regulation in PTSD. And I want to start out by talking about positive emotions because those are often emotional states that are actually more difficult for people with chronic early life trauma than the negative emotional states. And so often people have a complete incapacity to experience positive emotion, and if they do, they actually often go into intense negative states. And I think it's something that we're not paying enough attention to in the field. We're always focused on the negative emotional states, but I think this incapacity for positive emotions and to tolerate those is probably even a bigger problem. So what you see in these pictures here is exactly what our patients can't do, right? They don't have this capacity to tolerate positive affect. And so we developed 4 scripts that tapped into social and non-social emotions, and we'll be looking at that later on. But basically, we wanted to look at how people with chronic early life trauma and PTSD rate different positive and negative experiences. And so for the positive emotional responses, we see that PTSD patients report significantly less positive responses in response to positive emotional stimuli. And when we present them with negative emotional stimuli, we see they report increased negative emotions to negative emotional stimuli, but that they also report negative responses in response to positive stimuli, right? So there seems to be a decreased capacity for the experience of positive emotions, but even when positive stimuli are presented, they have negative emotional responses. So where may this come from? And one hypothesis we have is that our patients never had a chance to play, right? They were preoccupied with being in a fearful situation, with survival, having to figure out whether they're going to be hurt at any particular point in time. And so this capacity for play, to experience pleasure, to be curious, there was no time for that, right? So one hypothesis that we have is that this lack of play during crucial periods of development may be related to this difficulty with the experience of positive affect. I'm just going to skip this because we won't have enough time. Moving on in terms of talking about social emotions, which is obviously also a problem that a lot of patients with chronic childhood abuse face, is these real difficulties in social interactions. And so what's been emerging in both the psychology as well as the cognitive neuroscience literature recently is that there seems to be a real circuitry in the brain that deals with social emotions. And social emotions, and this has been reviewed by Haredi and Parkinson's in a great review, are really elicited by social interactions and require consideration of the self-relevance of stimuli and the appraisal of others' thoughts and emotional states. So it really requires a reflection on what is going on within you, what you're feeling, but also how that relates to another person that you're interacting with. And so we developed some scripts, both positive and negative scripts, that dealt with social and non-social scenarios. And we wanted to see first in healthy controls whether when people imagine themselves in both positive and negative social scenarios compared to non-social scenarios, whether we could tap into this circuitry in the brain that deals with social emotion processing. And what we're finding in healthy controls, again, this dorsomedial prefrontal cortex comes up, which is one of the key regions involved in social emotions. And whether the scripts are positive or negative in nature, in the healthy controls, we get a lot of activation of the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, as well as the temporal pole and the temporoparietal junction, all regions that are involved in social cognition. And so our hypothesis was that when our PTSD patients imagine themselves in the same social scenarios, that they would show less activation in this area, and that may underlie some of the social difficulties that they experience. And so when we compare controls with PTSD subjects, we find that the controls show significantly more activation in this dorsomedial prefrontal cortex when they're imagining themselves in these social scenarios. The other thing that we've been noticing a lot clinically is that our patients often can't make eye contact. It's very, very difficult for them, to look others in the eye. And of course, that's also a key part of normal social interaction. And I really like what Baron Cohen and Tomasello have said about eye contact, which is our eyes are said to be the mirror of our soul. Eye contact allows us to get an idea of what others have in mind and what they think, feel, or intend to do. And of course, when we think about eye contact, it takes us right back to the attachment system, right? The first time an infant really experiences eye contact is with its caregiver, and I think that's depicted really well in these pictures here, and of course, Alan Shore has written a lot about this as well. So this is really the origin of eye contact. So what can we learn about what happens in the brain during eye contact in PTSD related to early life trauma? And to start out with, I want to share this 30-second video of one of my patients who really tells us a little bit about how she feels when she makes eye contact.
When I make eye contact with someone and they can see me, that they can see that about how I feel about myself, that I'm not a good person or that's the things that I try to hide from people that I don't want them to know.
So she's afraid that people see that she's a bad person, right? She feels she's intensely bad, she has a lot of self-loathing, and she doesn't want people to see that. And that's why she has such difficulties making eye contact. So I was reading the literature in cognitive neuroscience, and a lot of things were coming out in healthy controls on direct versus averted gaze. And I came across a paradigm by Schrummel et al. That really studied direct versus averted gaze in healthy controls. And so I contacted him and I said, would you allow us to use your paradigm in our PTSD patients? And he said yes. And so I just want to share with you a couple of the virtual characters, what people actually saw when they were in the fMRI scanner. So the first character is a virtual character that approaches you with a direct gaze, and the second one approaches you with an averted gaze. So actually, this is of course the averted gaze. And I think this is the direct gaze. 1 second. And they were in three emotional states, so neutral, angry, and happy. And what we predicted was that in the controls, the direct versus the averted gaze would lead to more activation in the areas that deal with social emotions. So the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, the temporal pole, and the temporoparietal junction. And what we found was actually, I think, quite horrifying in that the control subjects, yes, they certainly showed significantly increased activation of the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, also the temporal pole and the parietal junction. But the PTSD patients didn't show any activation in those higher brain regions. And it was irrespective of the emotion. So it didn't matter whether it was neutral, happy, or angry, the emotional state of the virtual character. What the PTSD subjects activated was the superior colliculus periaqueductal gray, which is a brainstem structure really involved in defensive responses. And Panksepp has written a lot about this. It really gets you to sort of a lower level type of consciousness. And so the superior colliculus elicits defensive behaviors, including increased startle response, hypervigilance, cowering, and escape. Of course, that leads to decreased interaction with others. And it really represents sort of a lower level consciousness, sort of, probably towards survival. And so what does this mean? I mean, obviously, this is a virtual character. This is not a normal interaction. So, these results have to be interpreted with caution. But nevertheless, I think we have to think about future things that we need to study. First of all, what do these findings have in terms of the implication for the ability to engage in psychotherapy, right? Do our patients, when they come into psychotherapy, go to this lower level kind of consciousness, and aren't they able to activate higher cognitive centers that are really necessary for you to know what the other person may be feeling, thinking, how they may be relating to you? And if that's not possible, what can we do to activate those centers? I think we also need to think about to what extent do the neural networks underlying social emotions need to be intact in order to utilize social support before, during, and in the aftermath of trauma. We know through meta-analysis by Chris Bruin and others that social support after the trauma is the most important predictor of outcome. However, if we're having such difficulties with social emotions, does that hinder our ability to utilize social support and in that way, decrease the chance of positive outcome? I think we also need to think about, can activation of the social engagement system in psychotherapy lead to a reversal of the brain activation patterns that we've just seen, right? So successful psychotherapeutic interventions, can they reverse these difficulties that we've just looked at? And I think also importantly, what kind of implications does this have for the intergenerational transmission of trauma? For example, when traumatized moms with PTSD make direct eye contact with their babies, do we see the same response or not? I would hope not, but I think it's an empirical question. So I think a lot of questions come out of this research, and I think this whole area in social cognition and early life trauma will be really important in the future. So we've talked about emotional awareness being on one end of the spectrum. We've talked about mindfulness on the other. We've talked about emotion dysregulation, especially in terms of a problem with positive emotion tolerance and social emotions. Now let's move on to the sense of self. And of course, if we're not emotionally aware and if we can't regulate our emotions, it's really hard to know who we are, right? And I think we all know that the psychological trauma has a big effect on the sense of self, and that our patients often experience intense self-fragmentation, again, because they cannot regulate their emotions, and experiencing a variety of emotions at the same time and memories would be too overwhelming, so things have to be fragmented. And I think self-hatred and the self-loathing, which very much relates to this inability for a positive affect experience, is also very dominant in our patients. So this is a painting by one of my patients that I think really depicts the fragmentation of the self, and you can see how fragmented he experiences himself in this image. And I think when we ask our patients, when you look into the mirror, what happens? They say, when I look into the mirror, I often don't recognize myself. Sort of a classic symptom of dissociation, severe dissociation. As we already talked about, self-hatred and this lack of self-compassion is also very prominent. And I think this one statement here, I am broken, I am damaged, I ask myself why anyone would want a freak like me, and then I remember they don't and they never will. Or, dear me, I hate you, you're weak, you deserve the pain, you're imperfect, you'll never be good enough, I hope you die. I think really is the sad reality of a lot of our patients, and I think this is also very difficult psychotherapeutically to slowly and painfully bring some self-compassion online so the self-hatred decreases and the experience of positive affect increases. And often, like the patient that we saw earlier, when I look into the mirror, I'm afraid that I will see a monster, right? I'm afraid that people will know how bad I am. So what do we know about the sense of self? And Sterling Johnson was one of the first neurobiological researchers in cognitive neuroscience that started to really look at self-reflection and related it to a sense of self. Obviously, a sense of self is a very complex phenomenon, and it's obviously very difficult to study neurobiologically, but I think we have to start somewhere, and we have to get much better at developing scales that measure the sense of self so that later on we're able to correlate those with the neurobiological measures. So Sterling Johnson tells us about the sense of self. The ability to reflect upon oneself requires a robust sense of self, which has been described as a collection of schemata regarding one's abilities, traits, and attitudes that guides our behaviors, choices, and social interactions. And I really like this quote by Bromberg, who says, "Self-reflection allows a patient fully to exist in the moment and simultaneously perceive the self that is existing. The ability of the human mind to adaptationally limit its self-reflective capacity is the hallmark of dissociation." And I think he really captures the importance of self-reflection. So we've learned a lot neurobiologically what happens during self-reflection. There's a number of meta-analyses out, and two key brain areas seem to be involved in self-reflection. One is the posterior cingulate cortex that you'll be hearing a lot more about, and that really evaluates objects and past events for self-relevance. And of course, that's something that often goes awry in trauma, that you can't really judge how self-relevant something is, right? Often, a lot of things that aren't really self-relevant appear self-relevant to the traumatized population. So that's an area that's really important in self-referential processing. The other, again, is this dorsomedial prefrontal cortex that we've heard a lot about. That's really involved in self-reflective functioning as well as social cognition. What's also very interesting is that brain regions that have been associated with self-referential processing have been associated with what's called the default mode network, which is really one of the main networks in our brains that's active when we're at rest. So when our brain is just kind of sort of idling. So what do we know about the default mode network? And that's really been in the cognitive neuroscience literature for about 10 years now, and a lot of work has been done on it. And as I said before, it refers to the activity state of the brain at rest, so when our brain is idling. And it's active when individuals are not focused on the external environment. So when you're just kind of focused internally, and when you're engaged in self-referential processing, the default mode network is thought to be very active. And this network is also thought to consolidate, stabilize, and set the context for future information processing. So it kind of gets your brain ready for whatever it needs to do. And some people have referred to the default mode network actually as the conductor of all the other networks in the brain. Sort of, it gets you ready for whatever you're going to be faced with. And again, this is one of the first publications on the default mode network, and the default mode network is shown in the green areas here. So the posterior cingulate cortex that evaluates objects and past events for self-relevance, the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, that area involved in self-reflective functioning, and also the lateral parietal areas here that may be part of being able to experience an embodied sense of self. So what we've hypothesized is that maybe the default mode network may serve as a model for the sense of self. I know this is hypothetical, but again, it's something that we want to play with. And so in order to look at the default mode network in post-traumatic stress disorder related to early life trauma, the first thing we did was study a bunch of healthy individuals to see whether we could replicate the default mode network as it had been published in the cognitive neuroscience literature. And sure enough, as many other labs have done, when we studied healthy individuals just lying in the scanner at rest, we were able to replicate the default mode network. So we saw connectivity between the posterior cingulate cortex, the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, and the lateral parietal cortex, just like I've just shown you with those green areas. And so our hypothesis was that in PTSD subjects with a history of chronic early life trauma, that the integrity of this network would be affected. And what we saw in this patient population was actually that this network looks very, very different, right? So all we're seeing is connectivity within the posterior cingulate cortex, but we don't have the connectivity with the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, and we don't have the connectivity with the lateral parietal cortices. And these results have actually been recently replicated by Israel Lieberzon's group. So what does this mean? Does this reflect the disturbed sense of self our patients have? I don't know, but it's our hypothesis. And I think down the road, we really want to develop better measures to look at the sense of self in order to then be able to correlate those measures with the default mode network connectivity. I think we also need to ask ourselves, with successful psychotherapy, can we get back to more something like we see in healthy individuals, right? Can we bring this network back online? And we have some very preliminary evidence actually using EEG neurofeedback, so helping people to redirect their brain waves through a computer interface, that this, as an adjunct to psychotherapy in complex PTSD, actually brings the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex back online. So again, I think that's going to be a big area of future research. What's also very interesting is that developmentally, when infants are born, they don't have an intact default mode network. And the default mode network develops over time. And the default mode network we see in the chronic PTSD patients actually reflects how the default mode network looks in children ages 7 to 9. And so the question arises is, does childhood abuse through activating stress hormones, which can affect glial cells and the formation of the corpus callosum, which is the white matter tract that connects the parts of the default mode network, the posterior cingulate and the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, does that affect the integrity of this network? And it's interesting that several groups, including that of Mike DeBellis and Marty Teicher, have shown alterations in the corpus callosum related to childhood trauma. So again, that's something we'll be looking at in the future. So in summary then, we've looked at PTSD related to early life trauma. We've looked at how patients with early life trauma often have tremendous difficulties with emotional awareness. We looked at alexithymia. We looked at emotional numbing. And we also hypothesized that using mindfulness skills, teaching people to mindfully observe, may help people to overcome some of these difficulties. We've examined emotion dysregulation in PTSD related to early life trauma. We've looked at how difficult it is for people to often to tolerate positive affect. And we've also looked at how impaired social cognition is in these patients. And then we've looked at the sense of self, and we've hypothesized that the default mode network and its lack of integrity in PTSD may be a model for the sense of self in these patients. So what are the clinical applications or implications? I think one of the key things we have to think about is early intervention. I think it's great to help people psychotherapeutically when they're adults, but I think the earlier we can intervene, the more successful we'll be. And I probably shouldn't have been an adult psychiatrist, but I should have been a child psychiatrist, but it's too late now. So I think we need to ask the question, to what extent can early interventions that focus on increasing emotional awareness, self-reflection, and the capacity to mentalize modulate stress reactivity and the intergenerational transmission of trauma? And some great work is going on. We saw some work this morning by Kristen. Also Peter Fonagy's group and the Van Eisendorn group are all looking at this issue. And then, of course, can early intervention change the neurobiological developmental trajectories? And I think we really need to focus on identification of high-risk caregivers. And of course, Carlin has done a lot of work on this as well. So I think we really need to think increasingly about the implications and early interventions. And probably going back prenatally, because when I think about my patients, these problems really manifest themselves prenatally, that they can't connect with the baby. When it kicks, they have absolutely no response. Sometimes they hope it's dead because they're afraid it'll turn out like themselves or like their mothers. So I think the earlier that we can intervene, the better. And then I think no matter what we do with our adult patients, whether that's DBT or psychodynamic therapy or CBT or whatever therapy you want, I think we really need to work towards an embodied self that is capable of self-compassion. And so I just want to end on a note of hope. This is a picture of one of my patients who really perceived herself as very fragmented, as you can see from this image. And after 2 years of psychotherapy, she painted herself like this. Now you can see we're not on land yet, but she's able to withstand the waves that she's standing on. And you can see she's reaching out towards a higher power, and you can see the higher power is reaching back out towards her. Thank you.
We've been speaking about play all day. It's come up over and over, of course. And I was just wondering, are people using that as an approach to therapy? It seems to me that would be, Fred Donaldson has done this with animals, it seems like it's on the periphery of therapy. But do you know of any experiments that are going on using play with helping them learn how to play, either with a dog or with a person or something?
There is some, it's not play therapy, there's some studies being done with using animals in PTSD, sort of, pets, but I'm not aware of any play therapy that's being investigated. I think a lot of people encourage their patients to seek pleasure and joy as much as they can, and in a lot of the cognitive behavioral treatments, there'll be, positive events that you encourage your patients to do, but to actually, I'm not aware of a therapy that actually focuses on play, which is, I think, a very good question, and I think something we need to think about more in the future.
Leanne Cannon. I wonder if there is similar research out there, or if you have done it, that looks at less severe emotional effects, like, say, just alexithymia, and scanning the brains of those people, and if you can see the same sort of thing at a lesser level.
There are a number of studies looking at alexithymia. What most of these studies don't capture is psychopathology. So they're just using, they're bringing in healthy controls with a range of alexithymic symptoms. They don't look at child abuse, they don't look at psychiatric diagnoses usually. So I wonder, is this really a healthy population? Because they really show a high range or not. But from the studies I'm aware of to date, that hasn't been captured carefully. So yes, I think, there's people without psychopathology and alexithymia, but, they haven't been captured in terms of past histories very well.
I wondered about this was, I wonder how much of the problems that we talk about in terms of parenting attachment styles don't rise to the level of something as terrible as this complex PTSD, but which would show up as alexithymia. And like you said, we might think it's normal in the population, but maybe it's not, and we would like to see the scans, the evidence to show that this is something that not everybody is doing, that some people are doing, and we're classifying it as normal.
And absolutely, not everybody reacts like this, right? And there's a lot of factors that I think predict outcome, right? For example, Carl and I were just talking in the break, if there's a secure attachment figure that, a child has, even when experiencing abuse, that can often lead to much better outcomes, right? So there's a lot of factors that we have to be aware of. What I have shown is the saddest outcomes, absolutely, but not everybody has these difficulties.
Joanna McNeely. I actually have two questions for you, and you kind of addressed one right at the end. But if you could catch these mothers in their prenatal period via some sort of very quick nurse evaluation or a doctor quick evaluation, answer these questions, and these women were able then to get some sort of intervention, do you think, or do you know, or has there been a study that you could potentially sort of change that early infant interaction that they would have? And then second, just because when people like me deal specifically with these women, so if I deal 5,500 plus hours over the last 5 years dealing with women and men as they are pregnant and having these new babies, and seeing an immense range of people, and I've seen people who can't deal with the positiveness, like they just can't focus on anything positive. Can you point me to something that provides people like me with ways to cope in an ongoing situation with that?
Mm-hmm.
So 2 things.
For your first question, I'm not aware of any prenatal studies, but I defer to Kristen and Carlin whether there's any available, because I'm not that familiar with that literature. Are you guys aware of any?
Alicia Lewandowski at Michigan State is working on a project right now where they've been focusing on intervention efforts with pregnant women who are engaged in or have identified as being part of domestic violence relationships, also have significant trauma histories, and they're working to see if they can, they're really focusing on this idea of being able to keep the baby in mind. Can they improve that and then track those children long term? So I'm not sure if that work is available or published yet, but I think that is happening, at least.
And I think, there's so much hope. This work is showing that it's successful, but I can also give you a case example for one of the most severely alexithymic patients that we had, when she wasn't able to feel anything and she couldn't tolerate the child anywhere near her, to the point actually where the child said to her, "Mommy, can we play petting zoo and I'll be a piggy and you can pet me?" So at some level, this child was really resilient, but he also knew that his mother, being himself, couldn't give him what he needed. And so very slowly we did mindfulness skills with her, and over 2 or 3 years she was able to learn what she was feeling. But more importantly, in terms of the mother-child interactions, because she wasn't able to feel any love towards her child and she wasn't able to get close to him, we developed what's called a love touch. And so she would tell him that she's going to give him a love touch at first at a distance because she couldn't tolerate him closer. So she learned how to do that, and he quite liked that. And then over 2 or 3 years, she was now able to hold him and soothe him, and with a lot of work, but it was certainly worth it. So just keeping in mind where the mother is at, and just keeping up the hope, and setting goals that are achievable for the mother, doing a lot of these video interactions, so taping the mother with the child, that's being done in a lot of centers. Then having the mother reflect, again focusing on what she does well, not saying look, you suck here, you suck there, right? And then just very slowly doing exercises that she can do, right? Nothing that she can't do, and then really slowly bringing that online. But absolutely, is it worth it? When we saw her now being able to hold that child 3 years later and being able to feel love for that child, God, was it worth it, right? And you're treating 2 generations, right? So you're really killing 2 birds with 1 stone, right?
One more question? If not, we'll move to the general discussion. Let's have thank you so much. That's wonderful.